Another key part of Wesleyan pneumatology is how Wesleyan theology incorporates and understands the role of women. So the inclusion of women in ministry from the earliest days of the movement was part of the story. And even there was an official role of women preachers within the first generation, and a large reason for this was precisely because of their understanding of the Holy Spirit. John Wesley's, Charles Wesley's, and how they understood the doctrine and work of the Holy Spirit led them to embrace women preachers in a way that really wasn't happening around them at that time outside of the Quaker movement, who, as I said, also had a very high view of the Holy Spirit, a very integrated understanding of the Holy Spirit. A little background. Some of this is review, but it's worth highlighting even more closely. John Wesley's mother, Susanna Wesley, I'm a big fan, wrote an article on her. She's an amazing woman. She led a popular Bible study in Epworth while her husband was away in London for several months. She just took the lead in leading this Bible study, and people just kept coming and attending, and she found space for them all. In a short time, over 200 people attended, men and women, which was more than attended the Sunday services. So there was pushback against this by the curate, who was we can maybe call him the assistant pastor in that era. He was often the preacher, handled a lot of the day-to-day work, while the person whose parish it was doing other things, or sort of a lesser role, but still important. And he was jealous, to be honest. And so he wrote and asked Samuel Wesley to intervene. He said it violated the Conventicle Act, which was a law passed in the 17th century in England, which outlawed religious gatherings of more than 5 people outside of Church of England leadership. And Susanna Wesley wasn't an ordained or official Church of England. The pastors' wives didn't have any kind of rights then. And so he said it violated that, it could be liable for prosecution. So Samuel Wesley followed up. He wrote a letter to Susanna. He wasn't mad at her, but he said maybe the better part of valor, to keep the calm, it would be good for her to stop. So he asked her nicely, and Susanna wrote back, "I do not hear of more than 3 or 4 persons who are against our meeting, of whom Inman, the curate, is chief. He and Whiteley, I believe, may call it a conventicle. But we hear no outcry here, nor has anyone said a word against it to me. And what does their calling it a conventicle signify? Does it alter the nature of the thing, or do you think that what they say is of sufficient reason to forbear a thing that has already done much good, and may, by the blessing of God, do more?" She doesn't back down. She ended the letter by saying that if Samuel wanted her to stop, he had to command it. He had to order her to stop, not just ask her to stop, so as to put the weight of judgment of Christ on him, not her, for the work being stopped. That's right, Susanna Wesley. We don't know if Samuel ever replied. We don't have any record of that, and the meetings continued, so it seems that it discontinued. That was John Wesley's example. Through the letters, through their interactions, we see her just being this strong woman leader and teacher all throughout. And when you have that kind of experience growing up, as I had much the same, it's just a natural thing to see women in leadership and in teaching roles, because they've already served that role. And so John really was primed to be a participant in the changing experience and to embrace the role of women in this movement. So Wesley had a strong and clear role model in his mother, and that affected his views on lots of things, and not least of which women in ministry. Susanna was never officially a minister, but she was always a minister to John and Charles and the others. So she had this unofficial capacity that, once that is in place, it's a fine line between that and official capacity. So as early as his Georgia ministry in the mid-1730s, Wesley appointed women as deacons for important roles. We referred to the New Testament early church sources for authority in doing this, seeing women having offices, not ordained offices, mind you, at this time, but official offices within the church structure. Women later served as leaders of bands, which was the Wesleyan Methodist structure of organization, with 3 to 4 people who would talk more intimately in confession. So women served as leaders of bands and classes, which were about 12 people in Methodist communities. At first, just leading women, but later expanding to leading in neighborhoods. These bands and classes were geographically organized, and so women leaders would just lead whoever would lead within their neighborhood. So no matter who attended, these would be leaders. The initial impulse to make space for women was repeatedly confirmed, as some women showed clear ability, extraordinary gifting in these roles, and spiritual wisdom in their leadership. In fact, in 1742, one society, which is a community of many classes, a local community, so like what we would call a church, had 47 women leaders and 19 men. When you give space to the women, they tend to be involved, and as so often, women become the chief participants in a lot of church structures, and having an official space for that within the leadership recognizes what's already happening. Women were not allowed to preach sermons at first or do formal evangelism type acts in preaching, both because of Wesley's understanding of Paul's prohibition, so that the questions that are still raised in our era were raised then. Paul's seemingly clear statement about not allowing women speaking. And so he read that and said, well, that's how it is. And also because he didn't want to cause more problems with the Anglican Church. He was already running into a lot of barriers, and there was a lot of pushback against him and his ministry in the Methodists. He had never wanted to split off. He saw his work as a reforming, renewal movement within the church, but of course that causes some pushback against those who don't think they need to be renewed and are jealous of his successes and so on. So he was already dealing with troubles and didn't want to add more troubles to the list. Unofficially, however, he did not forbid women preachers. So while he didn't officially allow women to preach at first, increasingly there were women preachers who asked him for counsel, and he said, use your gifts. He encouraged those, like Sarah Crosby in a letter in 1661. Crosby had found herself in a situation not unlike Susanna Wesley, where she was leading these classes and found herself in situations where she was the one person who was gifted in speaking and teaching, and there were men and women there, and suddenly she was a preacher. And she asked John Wesley what she should do, and he basically said, if you have a calling, but not officially, but keep doing it. However, in 1771, he changed his official position. He was convinced by Mary Bosanquet that preaching by women should be allowed and even sponsored. So they were given sanctioning by the Methodist churches and given official roles as preachers after 1771. Convinced by Mary Bosanquet's scriptural unreasonable argument, she wrote John a letter and argued, based out of various passages in the New Testament, again, not unlike we still do today, noting that while Paul was clear in some passages, there were other passages which added complexity because he allowed women leaders and preachers in others. In fact, one key passage was the idea that women were prophesying, and that women were called to do tasks like that. And Mary asked John, well, how can you prophesy if you can't speak? So she was using very well-reasoned exegetical arguments. I mean, it's interesting in looking over these again to see that these are many of the same arguments that I wrestled with as I came to my own official position soon after college. I've always been open to women preachers, but never had looked closely until my church was engaged in a major controversy at the time. So I did my own study and came to the conclusion that Mary writes John. I wish I had read this earlier. It would have saved me a lot of time, right? The gifts were recognized because of the effective ministry of the women. That was really fundamentally the case. John Wesley was seeing that these women were effective teachers and leaders, not unlike his mother. So he basically said, if this is already happening, who am I to argue against the Spirit? He eventually recognized 27 different women as Methodist preachers. Most didn't have permanent positions. They weren't ordained as Church of England ministers, and so they didn't have their parishes. Well, this wasn't a separatist movement quite yet. But they did travel, and they spoke at different settings and were official preachers within the Methodist Church. Again, because the Church of England didn't ordain women, all the women were still considered lay workers, though their roles they were given were very expansive as fundamentally being pastors and preachers. Women also led in a variety of other ways, including at love feasts, which was the early church called their communion celebrations love feasts, and John Wesley adopted this as a pattern for the Methodist churches again. He didn't encourage separation from the Church of England, so part of the Methodist calling of the time was that you need to go to your Anglican church on Sundays and receive the official communion. But they had these Eucharistic meals, and there wasn't a formal Eucharist, but it had a Eucharistic orientation. It wasn't sacramental, but it really functioned in the same role as the early church in terms of a celebration together by those who are committed to the work of Christ, sharing their gifts, edifying each other. Women were also very important in various social actions, including founding and administration of orphanages, schools for underprivileged children, and so on, as well as preaching, leading class meetings, and other pastoral work. Basically anything men were doing, you could find Methodist women engaged in the same thing. One particular standout, who I don't spend a lot of time with after this, but is well worth noting, is Lady Selina Huntington, because she was particularly important in the overall Methodist leadership, even as her work has somewhat fallen in the background for various reasons. She founded a seminary, and she contributed in substantial ways to the leadership of the movement. She was clearly very wealthy and socially in a high class, and she used her position to really advocate and was a patroness for the Methodist movement, especially the Calvinist Methodists. That's the key part of why a lot of her leadership hasn't quite had the same resonance as you find other places, because she was primarily working with George Whitefield and the Calvinist Methodists, which after Wesley's death really separated, might be a strong word, but increasingly distanced, and there's really only a small remnant of them in the overall size of the Methodist Church. But again, she was a strong patron of Whitefield's ministry. She was extremely active in abolitionist and related social action causes, whereas John Wesley was both a preacher and a gifted teacher, and also a tremendous organizer and administrator. George Whitefield was a very gifted preacher and teacher, but he wasn't an organizer or administrator. And Lady Huntington really served that role in that side of the ministry. She was very gifted and inspiring and talented in bringing people together and raising funds and organizing. So she and Whitefield together served in that wing in a very, very profound way. Wesley encouraged women to take responsibility over their spiritual lives. He didn't see them as passive, and to take this responsibility over those around them, becoming active in using their gifts. However and wherever the Spirit led, whether in evangelism, helping the sick, ministering the outcast, wherever they felt called to do, he saw the women's calling as being responsive to the Spirit in the same way as anyone else. So he didn't relegate women to a second class, or just in a receiving way, or just in a service way. He really saw women as equal subjects in the Spirit's work. So part of the Spirit's work involves making space for others, after all. And so in making space for women to participate, Wesley was participating with the Spirit and encouraging women in the Methodist societies to likewise join in with the overall work. Wesley was also, very interestingly, attentive to language in a way that we think is much more contemporary. In his adaptation of the 39 Articles, the defining statements for the Church of England theology and polity for American use and for his churches there, he began actually a shift to using inclusive language. For instance, changing Christian men to Christians. Now, when we read his sermon, we still see a lot of the masculine language and tendencies. So this wasn't across the board, but it's interesting to see that he was increasingly attentive to this and very forward-looking in not only his inclusion, but also in a way how language works as an encouragement or as a distancing. Sadly, like with the issue of slavery, after Wesley's death, much of the Methodist tradition reverted back to non-inclusive rules, taking back on the kinds of social structures the rest of society have. In 1803, the British Methodist Church suspended all women preachers and no longer allowed them in that role. So we see really a step back by Methodism away from formally allowing women preachers, a distancing from the kinds of freedoms. Probably, now this bears further study, but my suspicion is, whereas Wesley had a very strong developed pneumatology, inasmuch as pneumatology itself drifted from the forefront, the social roles likewise reverted back to the standard church structures. It might be an interesting research paper there. But that said, while all women preachers were officially suspended and there was no official place, that was only loosely enforced. So even non-ordained women in the Methodist churches continued to serve informally in assorted ministry roles, including preaching and teaching. The Wesleyan Church, founded in the 1840s and combined with the Pilgrim Holiness Church in the late 60s, but the Wesleyan Church is actually one of the first denominations to give official ordination to women. The first superintendent of the Wesleyan Church actually participated in the first official ordination of a woman. It was before he was a superintendent, but he was a major part in that ceremony. And so we see these holiness movements, in the Wesleyan Church in particular, from the very beginning officially giving place to women beyond just either unofficial rules or just language. So this actually continues to be part of their denominational expectations. Candidates in the Wesleyan Church, and among others, I just know a little more about this one, having walked through this. Candidates are explicitly asked if they support women in ministry. Part of the interview process and application is, do you support women in ministry? And if you say no, then that's a barrier to participation in the church. It's probably also helpful to know, just not directly connected to Wesleyan theology, but Fuller is the same way, where those who work for Fuller are explicitly asked if they support women in ministry and have to answer yes as part of their work at Fuller, which is why I like working at Fuller.